The sharp, sterile snap of a latex glove, the dry, rhythmic rustle of printed medical charts sliding across a stainless steel counter, and then an absolute suffocating silence that made the fluorescent lights overhead feel entirely too bright. I was sitting inside a small, freezing consultation room on the fourth floor of the Seattle Children's Hospital. Across from me, Dr. Eris Thorne, a veteran pediatric oncologist whose temples had grayed prematurely from bearing too many impossible news cycles, lowered his reading glasses. He didn't look at me. Instead, he stared down at the crisp, multi-page genetic profiling report resting on his blotter, specifically the high-resolution human leukocyte antigen typing results that had just been pulled from the laboratory downstairs. Without a word, Dr. Eris Thorne pressed the intercom button on his desk and quietly instructed the nurse to draw my blood for a second time, right then and there, and run the panel through a completely different sequencer. I watched him do it. I watched the nurse wrap the rubber tourniquet around my arm, slide the butterfly needle deep into my vein, and siphon two dark vials of my life into plastic cylinders. I sat motionless as those vials were whisked away through the pneumatic tube system in the wall. 40 minutes later, the second set of printouts arrived. Dr. Eris Thorne looked at the second result, went entirely still, and then turned the monitor toward himself to re-verify every single data point. When he finally lifted his gaze, his eyes carried a heavy, guarded weight. He asked me in a carefully measured, fragile voice if we could speak privately, away from the nurse's station. I didn't blink. I didn't cry. My hands, calloused and stained with walnut wood stain from 16 years of working a bandsaw in my remote Oregon carpentry shop, rested flat and steady on my knees. I didn't need him to spell it out for me. I was in that hospital because my oldest son, Lucas, was dying, and I had come to offer my own bone marrow to save his life. Lucas was 16 years old, a boy who should have been spending his weekends tuning up dirt bikes or sketching blueprints for tree houses, was instead trapped behind a heavy glass door in the oncology ward, fighting a ferocious treatment-resistant relapse of acute lymphoblastic leukemia. The aggressive chemotherapy rounds had already stripped away his hair, carved deep hollows into his cheeks, and reduced his sturdy frame to something frighteningly fragile. The doctors had drawn up a strict, merciless timeline. Unless a matching stem cell donor could be found within a razor-thin window of clinical stability, the cancer would roar back and overrun his system entirely. When a bone marrow transplant becomes a patient's final lifeline, the medical protocol is systematic and unforgiving. They test siblings first, because shared parentage offers the highest statistical odds of finding a compatible tissue match. They had tested Lucas's twin brother, Liam, first, fraternal twins born 6 minutes apart, sharing a womb yet governed by independent genetic blueprints. Liam had sat in the adjacent room while the cotton swab scraped the inside of his cheek, praying that his DNA would match his brother's. 2 days later, the laboratory report came back negative. Liam was not a match. Next in line were the parents. According to the strict, unbending laws of human genetics, a biological parent always shares at least a 50% genetic haplotype match with their child. A mother always passes down half of her genetic markers. A father passes down the other half. When a child's life hangs in the balance and the registry comes up empty, a parent's marrow is the ultimate safety net. That was why I had rolled up my sleeves without a second thought. That was why I'd driven 80 miles through a freezing mountain downpour from my woodshop in Oregon, running entirely on black coffee and sheer desperation. I didn't care about statistics or probabilities. My son needed marrow, and I had marrow. To me, the mathematical equation of parenthood was complete. Except human genetics do not care about love. They only care about code. Dr. Eris Thorne cleared his throat, folding his hands over the diagnostic graphs. He looked at me with a profound professional empathy, bracing himself to witness a mother's world shatter into dust. "Mrs. Vance," he began, his voice barely rising over the hum of the air purifier, "I need you to look at these markers with me. When we run a high-resolution HLA profile between a mother and a biological child, we look for specific inherited gene sequences. A biological mother will always share a baseline half-match with her offspring. Always." He paused, letting the clinical weight of his words settle into the room. "Your tissue typing does not share those markers, Mrs. Vance. Not a single foundational allele lines up. According to these genetic charts, you are not a biological match to Lucas. In fact, you share 0 maternal DNA markers with him at all." He stopped waiting for the screaming to start, waiting for the denial, the tears, the sudden collapse of a woman who had just discovered that her child was not hers by blood. I didn't scream, I didn't pull my hands away. I simply looked past the doctor's shoulder, watching the gray Seattle rain streak down the hospital window pane. Dr. Eris Thorne stared at me, visibly unsettled by my lack of panic. I looked him dead in the eye, my voice steady, quiet, and entirely absolute. "I know," I said. "I've known since the first day I held him in my arms, and it doesn't change a single damn thing." That answer in the hospital room wasn't born in a vacuum. It was forged 17 years ago, inside the freezing walls of a drafty, sawdust-choked timber shed in the foothills of Oregon. I was 25 years old back then. My entire world consisted of a heavy-duty bandsaw, stacks of raw pine lumber, and the rhythmic, steady scrape of a handplane smoothing down rough edges. I lived alone, worked alone, and expected nothing from the world except the quiet predictability of grain and timber. Then came the afternoon the brakes failed. The sound still echoes in my chest whenever the winter wind rattles the corrugated metal roof of my shop. The screech of tortured metal, tires screaming against wet gravel, and a battered, smoking sedan careening past my woodpile before grinding to a violent halt against my front porch. I dropped my chisel and ran out into the freezing drizzle. The driver's door swung open, and out spilled a woman who looked like she was standing on the absolute edge of a cliff. Her name was Clara. She was 25, just like me, but she looked decades older, hollowed out by a terror so absolute it drained the color right out of her face. She was 4 months pregnant with twins, carrying a swollen belly under a soaked flannel shirt, shivering uncontrollably. The man who had gotten her pregnant, a local drifter who had promised her the stars, had caught wind of the pregnancy and vanished clean out of the state, leaving behind a disconnected phone number. Clara had no money, no family willing to take her in, and nowhere left to drive. She didn't fall apart because of the wrecked car. She fell apart because she had hit the end of the line. I didn't ask her a life story. I walked back into the warmth of my shop, poured a steaming mug of hot cocoa with extra heavy cream, and led her to the small loft above the workshop where I kept my cot. "You're staying right here," I told her, setting the mug on the wooden nightstand. "We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." Tomorrow turned into months. When Clara's body gave out under the crushing weight of the pregnancy, forcing a traumatic premature labor 5 months later, I was the one who drove her through a blinding snowstorm to the county clinic. I paid the deposits for the cramped, drafty 2-room apartment down the road. And when the twins, Lucas and Liam, finally clawed their way into the world 6 minutes apart, crying in a harsh tin can rhythm against the sterile lights of the delivery room, I was standing right beside the hospital bed. The biological father was a ghost who never crossed state lines again. Clara, battered by severe postpartum exhaustion and a depression so heavy it seemed to sink the floorboards, stared at the twin cribs in the corner with a blank, terrifying numbness. She couldn't look at them without weeping. 6 months after they were born, Clara packed a single canvas suitcase while the boys were sleeping. She left a folded piece of lined notebook paper on the kitchen counter, scribbled in erratic handwriting. "I can't do this, Alina. They deserve a life I'll never be strong enough to give them. I'm leaving. Take care of them." By the time I drove over the next morning, the apartment was dead silent. The door was unlocked, Claire's car was gone, her tires cutting tracks deep into the muddy gravel of the driveway, heading south toward the interstate. I walked into the small bedroom. Two infant boys lay wide awake in their cribs, staring up at the water-stained ceiling, kicking their tiny legs in unison. They had no one, no blood relatives willing to answer the phone, just a 25-year-old carpenter standing in a doorway with a pocket full of sawdust and an empty house. I didn't hesitate, not for a single heartbeat. I walked into the county courthouse 3 weeks later with a stack of emergency guardianship papers and a lawyer whose retainer ate up half my savings. I changed their last names to Vance, I scrubbed away their past, and built a brand new foundation. From that moment on, the books were closed on biology. Motherhood wasn't an accident of genetics, it was an act of raw, daily construction. Over the next 16 years, I built my entire universe around those two boys. My woodshop became a playground and a classroom. I taught Lucas how to measure twice and cut once, guiding his small fingers along the heavy steel blade of the scroll saw. I spent countless sleepless nights pacing the floorboards of our home, holding a feverish, screaming toddler in each arm until the sun painted the mountain ridges pink. I was the one who patched up scraped knees, pulled splinters out of calloused little thumbs, and sat on hard plastic chairs in emergency rooms when Lucas broke his collarbone falling out of an ancient oak tree behind the local school. I coached their little league baseball teams, built custom bunk beds with secret compartments, and stood in freezing November bleachers cheering until my voice cracked. I did it because I wasn't legally obligated. I did it because those boys were mine. Every splinter in my hands, every drop of sweat, every dollar I scraped together from selling handcrafted tables, it all belonged to them. I built their childhood out of hammers, nails, unconditional love, and an absolute promise that no matter what storms blew over our porch, they would never, ever feel unwanted. I thought that kind of foundation was indestructible. I thought if you love hard, honesty and loyalty will follow. I was wrong. Because 4 years ago, when the boys were 12, the ghosts from the past finally smelled blood in the water, and the quiet life I had hammered together with my own two hands began to splinter at the seams. For 12 years, the walls of that house held tight. The twins grew into tall, sharp-witted boys who helped me sand tabletops on weekends, measuring grain patterns with calloused fingers and laughing when fine sawdust stuck to my eyelashes. My custom woodshop had expanded. My designs were featured in 3 regional architecture magazines, and the bank account I kept tucked away for their college fund finally had a respectable cushion. That was when the ghosts decided the harvest was ready. It started with a sharp, insistent knock on my front door on a rainy Tuesday afternoon 4 years ago. A man named Richard Vance, a sleek, sharp-suited real estate developer who claimed distant legal ties to my late grandfather's old property deeds, stepped onto my porch. But Richard wasn't interested in property lines or timber rights. He was holding a heavy, certified manila envelope containing crisp, photocopied pages of the original guardianship filings from 17 years ago, alongside a freshly printed retainer agreement from a high-priced family law firm down in Portland. Standing right beside him in the wet gravel of my driveway was Clara. She wasn't the broken, shivering ghost of a girl I had sheltered in my loft all those years ago. She was draped in an expensive designer trench coat, her hair professionally colored, her eyes hard and calculating. The years had hardened her, and success, or rather the financial backing of Richard, who had recently married her into a life of suburban wealth, had given her a weapon. They hadn't come to visit, they had come to collect what they suddenly decided belonged to them. The legal assault was swift, cold, and calculated to destroy. Richard's lawyers filed an emergency petition in family court challenging the validity of my 17-year-old guardianship on technicalities regarding original parental notification, backed by a manufactured affidavit signed by Clara claiming she had been coerced and mentally unstable when she left the boys behind. But the true leverage wasn't legal precedent, it was extortion. 2 days after the initial court filing, Richard cornered me in the gravel parking lot behind my woodshop. He didn't raise his voice. He leaned casually against the fender of his luxury SUV, smiling a thin, corporate smile that my stomach churned. "You can fight us in court for the next 2 years, Elena," Richard told me, his voice smooth and venomous. "You can drain every penny of your little woodshop savings paying attorneys, but by the time the judge rules, those boys will be dragged through depositions, media leaks, and courtrooms. They will learn that you aren't their real mother. They will learn that you bought them with charity and paper. Do you really think two 12-year-old boys will ever look at you the same way once they know you've been lying to them their entire lives?" He left the ultimatum hanging in the damp, freezing air like poison. I was caught in a brutal trap where every single exit led to bloodshed. If I fought to the bitter end in a courtroom battle, the toxic media exposure and brutal custody depositions would shatter the fragile emotional stability of Lucas and Liam right at the onset of their teenage years. Puberty is already a war zone. Adding a public identity crisis would break them beyond repair. But if I surrendered without a fight, I would have to sign away my legal rights, hand them over to a woman who had abandoned them in infancy, and walk out of their lives forever. I chose the cross. I chose the option that broke my own heart into a million pieces, so theirs hadn't to have to shatter. On a bleak Friday afternoon, sitting across a polished mahogany conference table from Richard's high-priced lawyers, I signed the voluntary surrender of guardianship. I agreed to step down as their legal mother, transferring custody to a neutral trust managed under Richard and Clara's household in exchange for an ironclad court seal preventing them from ever weaponizing my past against the boys in public. I didn't tell Lucas and Liam. I couldn't bear to look into their eyes and explain why the woman who raised them was handing them over to strangers. That night, I packed a single canvas duffel bag into the back seat of my old truck, left the keys to the main house on the kitchen counter, and drove 40 miles south to a small abandoned mechanic's garage that I rented as a makeshift, isolated woodshop. I had no home, no family, and no rights. 3 weeks into my exile, while I was sitting alone on an upturned paint bucket in the dark, freezing corner of my new workshop, my phone buzzed against the concrete floor. It was a text message from an unknown number, featuring a photo of Lucas and Liam smiling at a suburban birthday party standing next to Clara and Richard. Above the photo was a sentence written with surgical cruelty. The boys said they are deeply ashamed to have ever called a poor, uneducated carpenter their mother. They asked you never to contact them again. Do not ever show your face around them. My hands shook so violently I dropped the phone onto the sawdust. I didn't reply. I didn't call to check if it was true. I simply picked up the phone, powered it down, pulled the heavy iron bolt across the workshop door, and plunged myself into 3 years of complete, self-imposed silence, believing every single word of the lie that had just stolen my children away. 3 years of absolute deafening silence vanished in a single fraction of a second. It was the dead of a freezing winter night in early 2026. The wind was howling against the corrugated iron siding of my abandoned workshop, rattling the window panes as I sat alone in the dark, carving a small wooden bird by the dim light of a desk lamp. Then the sharp, shrill ring of my old cell phone cut through the quiet, a phone I had kept powered on for emergencies, though no one had called or texted in 36 months. I flipped it open. The screen flashed with an incoming number I didn't recognize, but the voice that came through the speaker shattered my chest instantly. Mẹ ơi, anh Lucas tái phát bệnh rồi. Bác sĩ bảo không còn thời gian nữa. It was Liam, my youngest, now a tall boy of 16, his voice completely broken, choking back ragged, terrified sobs through the static of the line. He wasn't calling from a warm suburban living room. He was calling from the pediatric ICU of Seattle Children's Hospital. Lucas's leukemia had roared back with a vengeance, aggressive and treatment-resistant. The chemotherapy had failed entirely, ravaging his young body. The doctors had given them days, perhaps hours, unless an emergency bone marrow stem cell match was found immediately through strict familial testing. I didn't grab a coat. I didn't lock the side door. I ran straight out into the freezing midnight drizzle, jumped into the cab of my dusty truck, and slammed my foot down on the gas pedal. I drove the 80 miles north through the dark, winding mountain passes of Oregon, my knuckles bleeding white against the steering wheel, running entirely on pure adrenaline, black coffee, and blind terror. When I burst through the double doors of the fourth-floor oncology wing, the sterile hospital lights hit me like a physical blow. The air smelled of sharp antiseptic and lingering dread. Standing right outside Lucas's glass-walled isolation room was Clara. She wasn't wearing her expensive designer trench coats anymore. Her hair was completely disheveled, her face streaked with old mascara, her hands shaking violently against her wool sweater. She had just been informed by the hospital's transplant coordinator that every single family blood relative, including herself and Richard, had been tested against the National Registry and hospital blood banks, and every single tissue sample had come back as a complete dead-end mismatch. The family pool of blood had run completely dry, leaving them with 0 options left on the table. As soon as she saw me barreling down the hallway in my dusty work boots and heavy flannel shirt, Clara panicked. She lunged forward, grabbing my arm with a desperate, clawing grip, trying to physically block the doorway to the intake lab to protect her own hidden secrets from the medical staff. "You can't go in there, Alina," Clara hissed, her voice shrill, frantic, and dripping with raw terror. "If you run your blood, the doctors will dig into the files. They'll find out the guardianship papers from 17 years ago were built on a house of cards. You'll destroy everything." I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I looked straight into her terrified eyes, wrenched my arm out of her grasp with a single sharp jerk, and shoved past her into the registration bay. I slammed my hands down on the stainless steel reception counter, looking directly at the head nurse. "I am Lucas Vance's mother," I said, my voice cutting through the clinical hum of the ward with absolute terrifying authority. "Draw my blood right now and run the HLA compatibility panel immediately." They rushed the samples down to the basement laboratory under strict emergency protocol. Dr. Eris Thorne, the same veteran oncologist who had overseen Lucas's case from day one, stood by the diagnostic monitor as the high-resolution sequencer spat out the genetic haplotypes line by line. And that's when the second, inescapable medical truth struck the room like thunder. The computer screen flashed red. The numbers on the HLA tissue typing printout didn't just fail to match, they proved an absolute mathematical impossibility of direct biological parentage. The genetic markers on chromosome 6 showed zero inherited lineage between my DNA and Lucas's. In the eyes of the law, and in the cold, unfeeling logic of human genetics, I was a complete stranger to the boy I had raised with my own 2 hands. Dr. Eris Thorne turned slowly from the monitor, staring at me with a profound, stunned silence, while the hospital's emergency medical board, forced by automated protocol to audit the child's complete birth history when parental matching failed, began unearthing the sealed, decades-old registry files from the county courthouse. The secret I had carried for 17 years, the secret Clara had tried so desperately to bury under years of wealth and manipulation, and the shattering truth that I was not their biological mother, was laid bare across the stainless steel desk, right before the eyes of the entire medical board. In the quiet, heavy tension of the hospital conference room, surrounded by the clinical hum of monitors and the stern, watchful faces of the medical board, the unvarnished truth of my 16 years of quiet sacrifice was finally laid bare on the steel table. Dr. Eris Thorne didn't offer pity, nor did he offer empty judicial judgment. He simply looked across the room at me with a profound, solemn reverence. In a medical world governed entirely by genetic lines and biological chains, the doctors recognized something far rarer: a woman who carried zero blood relation to the child, yet had willingly burned down her entire life, her legal standing, and her hard-earned anonymity just to give a dying boy a fighting chance at tomorrow. While the board quietly reviewed the historical registry files, the real earth-shattering shockwaves were already echoing down the sterile corridors of the pediatric ward. Liam hadn't stayed quietly in the waiting lounge. Driven by a sudden, fierce protective instinct when he overheard the fragmented, desperate arguments outside the nurses' station, my youngest son had slipped unnoticed into the administrative records office during a shift change. His trembling fingers had pulled the digital audit printout and the original sealed custody archives from the terminal. He read every single line, detailing how Clara and Richard had weaponized a manufactured lie, how they had fabricated a cruel text message 3 years ago to sever our ties, and how I had walked away into a silent, self-imposed exile so the courts wouldn't tear their fragile teenage world apart. The papers were still clutched tightly in Liam's hand when Liam burst through the heavy double doors of Lucas's glass-walled isolation room. Lucas was lying pale, thin, and exhausted against the hospital pillows, the chemotherapy drip line snaking into his arm, listening to the monotonous, steady beep of the heart monitor. Without a single word of introduction, Liam dropped the printed hospital records and the original sealed custody archives right across his older brother's lap. "Read it," Liam choked out, his voice cracking with a volatile mixture of raw fury and overwhelming grief as hot tears spilled down his cheeks. "Read what they did to her. Read how she wasn't forced to stay by law. She chose to stay, and then they threw her out just to keep us trapped in their lies." Lucas's weak fingers slowly unfolded the crisp papers, his wide eyes scanning the certified adoption surrender documents, tracing the cold, unyielding legal text that unraveled every single narrative he had been fed for the last 3 agonizing years. The grand illusion shattered right there in the sterile isolation room. The mother they had been taught to resent, the woman the cruel text messages branded as a poor, uneducated carpenter to be deeply ashamed of, was the only human being on earth who had ever bled for them. Without waiting for another second, Liam turned on his heel, bolted out of the glass isolation ward, and marched straight down the hallway toward the waiting area where Clara and Richard were standing frozen near the vending machines. Clara flinched violently as Liam came to a dead stop right in front of her, his young eyes blazing with a cold, unforgiving hatred that mirrored my own worst moments of despair. "You lied to us every single day," Liam shouted, his voice ringing sharply off the tiled hospital walls, stripping away every last ounce of the suburban dignity Clara had spent years fabricating. "You told us she didn't want us. You told us she was ashamed of our lives. But she's the one in there ready to give her life, while you've been standing here hiding like a coward." Clara opened her mouth, her face draining of all color, her hands clawing desperately at her expensive designer scarf as she tried to stammer out a broken defense. "Liam, please listen to me. We only tried to protect—" "Save it," Liam cut her off, his voice dropping into a razor-sharp whisper that echoed louder than any scream. "We know everything. Get out of our sight. Don't you ever dare call yourself our mother again." Standing just a few paces away, in the dim shadows of the corridor, I watched the absolute catastrophic collapse of the mask. Richard shrank back against the drywall, unable to meet anyone's eyes, while Clara crumpled against the tile, her calculated facade completely reduced to ash. The manipulation, the lies, and the years of stolen exile were finally laid bare under the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital hallway, leaving nothing behind except the unyielding, unbreakable truth of what real love actually meant. For the first time in 3 long, agonizing years, the darkness had nowhere left to hide. In the quiet, heavy tension of the hospital conference room, surrounded by the clinical hum of monitors and the stern, watchful faces of the medical board, the unvarnished truth of my 16 years of quiet sacrifice was finally laid bare on the steel table. Dr. Eris Thorne didn't offer pity, nor did he offer empty judicial judgment. He simply looked across the room at me with a profound, solemn reverence. In a medical world governed entirely by genetic lines and biological chains, the doctors recognized something far rarer: a woman who carried zero blood relation to the child, yet had willingly burned down her entire life, her legal standing, and her hard-earned anonymity, just to give a dying boy a fighting chance at tomorrow. While the board quietly reviewed the historical registry files, the real, earth-shattering shockwaves were already echoing down the sterile corridors of the pediatric ward, dismantling years of calculated deceit in a matter of minutes. Liam hadn't stayed quietly in the waiting lounge, driven by a sudden, fierce protective instinct when he overheard the fragmented, desperate arguments outside the nurse's station. My youngest son had slipped unnoticed into the administrative records office during a shift change. His trembling fingers pulled the digital audit printout and the original sealed custody archives from the terminal. He read every single line, detailing how Clara and Richard had weaponized a manufactured lie, how they had fabricated a cruel text message 3 years ago to sever our ties, and how I had walked away into a silent, self-imposed exile so the courts wouldn't tear their fragile teenage world apart. The papers were still clutched tightly in his hand when Liam burst through the heavy double doors of Lucas's glass-walled isolation room, his chest heaving with exhaustion and adrenaline, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and burning fury. Lucas lay pale, thin and exhausted against the hospital pillows, the chemotherapy drip line snaking into his arm, listening to the monotonous, steady beep of the heart monitor. Without a single word of introduction, Liam dropped the printed hospital records and the court files right across his older brother's lap. "Read it," Liam choked out, his voice cracking with a volatile mixture of raw fury and overwhelming grief. Lucas's weak fingers slowly unfolded the crisp papers, his wide eyes scanning the certified adoption surrender documents, tracing the cold, unyielding legal text that unraveled every single narrative he had been fed for the last 3 agonizing years. The grand illusion shattered right there in the sterile isolation room. The mother they had been taught to resent, the woman the cruel text messages branded as a poor, uneducated carpenter to be deeply ashamed of, was the only human being on earth who had ever bled for them. Every single memory of the past 3 years fractured under the weight of this sudden, blinding clarity. Lucas began to tremble, realizing that the coldness he thought I felt toward them was nothing more than a fiction engineered by people who cared more about control, status, and social reputation than human life itself. The foundations of his teenage world crumbled into dust, replaced by the crushing weight of a sacrifice he was only now beginning to understand. The silence in the room grew deafening as the brothers confronted the monumental betrayal of their past, realizing that every comforting lie they had lived under was built on the ruins of my broken heart. The weight of those lost years hung heavily in the sterile air, dissolving every shred of doubt they had ever harbored against me, leaving behind a raw, piercing realization of devotion. Without waiting for another second, Liam turned on his heel, bolted out of the glass isolation ward, and marched straight down the hallway toward the waiting area where Clara and Richard stood frozen near the vending machines. Clara flinched violently as Liam came to a dead stop right in front of her, his young eyes blazing with an unforgiving hatred that mirrored my own worst moments of despair. "You lied to us every single day," Liam shouted, his voice ringing sharply off the hospital walls, stripping away every last ounce of Clara's fabricated dignity. "She's the one in there ready to give her life, while you've been standing here hiding like a coward." Clara opened her mouth, her face draining of all color, trying desperately to stammer out a broken defense. "Liam, listen to me." "Save it." Liam cut her off, his voice dropping into a razor-sharp whisper. "We know everything. Get out of our sight. Don't you dare ever call yourself our mother again." Standing just a few paces away in the dim shadows of the corridor, I watched the absolute, catastrophic collapse of the mask. Richard shrank back against the drywall, entirely unable to meet anyone's eyes, while Clara crumpled against the tile, her calculated facade completely reduced to ash. The manipulation, the lies, and the years of stolen exile were finally laid bare under the harsh, fluorescent lights of the hospital hallway, leaving nothing behind except the unyielding, unbreakable truth of what real love actually meant. For the first time in 3 long, agonizing years, the darkness had nowhere left to hide, and the bitter winter finally broke into dawn. One full cycle of seasons has quietly turned since that exhausting battle under the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital, and the sharp bite of winter has finally yielded to a warm, breathing spring. Time doesn't heal everything on its own, but it gives truth a deep, enduring chance to take root in the soil of our lives. Today, the afternoon sunlight spills in golden blocks across the wide wooden floor of my workshop, catching the fine, rising dust of cedar and pine. At the center of the room stands Lucas. He has just turned 17, and the pale, hollow look of sickness is completely gone from his face. His dark hair has grown back in soft, thick curls, and his shoulders, once slumped under the weight of an IV pole and 3 years of manufactured lies, are broad and steady as he guides a heavy hand plane across an old oak workbench. The rhythmic hiss of the blade smoothing the rough timber is the sound of a life reclaimed from the very edge of the grave. He doesn't say a word as he works, completely absorbed in the clean scent of sawdust and the tactile resistance of the wood under his palms. I stand just a few paces away, leaning quietly against the rack of chisels, watching the steady, unbroken focus in his eyes. There are no grand speeches needed anymore. The workshop has become our quiet sanctuary where broken pieces are glued together, one smooth shaving at a time. Yet the ripples of our past did not vanish overnight. Just last week, during a routine trip to file the final permanent custody extensions at the city courthouse, our paths crossed one last time in the dim, empty limestone hallway near the public archives. Clara was standing alone by the tall, arched windows, her designer handbag clutched like a shield against her chest, her face drained of the haughty arrogance she once wore like an unyielding armor. She looked smaller, weathered by the sudden abandonment of everyone she had manipulated, her eyes darting nervously toward me as I walked past. For a fraction of a second, I saw her lips part, as if gathering the desperate fragments of a final defensive excuse to justify the ruin she had wrought upon our lives. I didn't stop. I didn't raise my voice, nor did I offer a single word of bitter retaliation or triumphant scorn. I simply paused, looked her straight in the eyes with a profound, unshakable serenity, and gave her a quiet nod of absolute release. That single calm glance stripped away whatever dignity she thought she had left, leaving her to face the cold, hollow ghost of her own deceit, a self-inflicted prison of eternal regret that no court order or manufactured lie could ever help her escape. She turned her face away toward the quass, shrinking entirely into the shadows as I walked onward into the light. With the legal battles finally behind us and full, unreserved custody restored where it always belonged, our little wooden house on the edge of town has transformed into something sacred. The evenings no longer echo with heavy silences or fractured tension. Instead, they ring with the bright, overlapping laughter of Lucas and Liam arguing over dinner recipes, the cheerful clatter of silverware, and the sharp banter of teenage life returning to normal. Our home smells like warm bread, linseed oil, and the sweet relief of a family made whole not by biological chains, but by the fierce, unbroken courage of deliberate choice. As I sit here tonight on the front porch, watching the last amber embers of the sunset bleed into the quiet hills, my thoughts drift back across the long, brutal road we traveled to reach this hard-earned peace. I find myself looking straight ahead, past the quiet porch, past the rustling pines, looking directly into your eyes through the microphone, wondering about the hidden burdens you might be carrying right now. Let me ask you this one question to carry with you into the dark. How many truths in your life are you currently burying deep inside out of a cowardly fear that honesty might hurt someone, only to realize your silence has become the very prison cell locking up your love? We spend our whole lives worshiping bloodlines and biological chains, forgetting a fundamental truth that the universe whispers back to us every single day. Blood might create a physical vessel, but it is our choices, our reckless, stubborn, terrifying choices to stand by someone when the entire world turns its back, that truly build a family. The battle for Lucas was won in a courtroom by legal technicalities or hidden medical files. It was won because someone decided that love is an action, not an accident. And right now, somewhere out there in the quiet corners of this world, another family is sitting by a hospital bed, holding their breath, watching a heart monitor tick downward as a sick child counts down their final days against an unforgiving clock. You don't need a shared last name or a matching genetic code to be someone's miracle. You only need the courage to make a choice. If you are listening to this right now, I'm asking you to take a moment before this day ends. Register as a bone marrow donor today, because somewhere out there in the vast, uncertain dark, a single choice made by your hands right now could be the exact reason a dying child gets to wake up and see tomorrow. Don't wait for a tragedy to teach you what real love costs. Make the choice. Change a life.
Before we say goodbye, I want to talk to you for just a moment. Wherever you are right now, what city are you sitting in, and what time is it on your clock as you watch this? Let me know in the comments below so I can see just how far this story traveled to reach you. More importantly, looking at this story, what is the biggest lesson you are taking away today? Is it about the strength to stand back up when everything is stripped away, the courage to walk away from toxic bonds, or the realization that human dignity and self-respect can never be bought with a price tag? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and I would love to know how this resonated with you. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next story. Thank you so much for watching. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.